Hello, I'm Johann Chacko with the Southwest Initiative for the Study of Middle East Conflicts, and welcome to the second in our series of SISMEC Presents, where we look at some of the most pressing political conflicts in the Middle East through the eyes of people who have to deal with it for a living. Today we have Ali G. Scotten, a senior consultant at a major Washington D.C. Consultancy, where he serves as a leading linguist and analyst on Iranian foreign policy and domestic issues. Ali was the 2008-2009 Huffington Fellow at Georgetown University's Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, and in 2007 he won the American Anthropological Association's Middle East Thesis of the Year award for his thesis on the history and archaeology of Iran. More recently, his commentary has been featured on the Washington Post, Christian Science Monitor, and McClatchy News. Ali, very happy to have you here, and
Thank you.
welcome back to Tucson.
It's a pleasure.
Okay. Iran's hardliners have attempted to portray the events in Tunisia and Egypt of the recent weeks as extensions of the Islamic Iranian Revolution of 1979, and essentially take credit for this for these momentous changes. But on the other hand, the actual participants in these events have gone to great lengths to distance themselves from the Islamic Republic and even the notion of an Islamic revolution. What do you think the overall impact of recent events will be on the legitimacy of the Iranian government, both at home in Iran and more broadly across the Middle East as a region?
Well, as you said, unsurprisingly, the Islamic Republic is trying to take credit for what's going on in Egypt and what happened in Tunisia. That's pretty unsurprising. They came out, and the Supreme Leader and many other officials came out and said that basically this was the culmination of the Islamic Revolution and what Khomeini had called for, which is the propagation of the Islamic Revolution. As you said, the Muslim Brotherhood came out and denied that was their intention. Even on BBC Persian, another Muslim Brotherhood member was interviewed and said that he thanked the Supreme Leader for support, but he said basically thanks but no thanks. But the Muslim Brotherhood is not interested in Islamic Revolution. We just want to back the people. If you read the reports from Iran's Press TV, which is the government-sponsored English news, they quoted the first half of that sentence, thanking the Supreme Leader, and left that part out. So obviously, they're trying their best to portray this as part of their doing. However, as you said, they are definitely, I feel, worried that the current events could be decreasing their legitimacy in the region. And by legitimacy, I mean their stance or their intention to be seen as the vanguard of anti-Israel or pro-Palestinian rhetoric and the leader of the Islamic world against Western imperialism. If in Egypt the Muslim Brotherhood does gain a large foothold in the future parliament or the democratic system, although Western analysts fear that this could be to Iran's benefit, it's the same fear that they have about the spreading of the Shia crescent with Iraqi Shias becoming more powerful. What happened in Lebanon with Hezbollah recently, basically
the new government
forcing Rafiq Hariri to resign, basically. However, one can see another alternative in which a rising Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, a Sunni group with ties to Hamas, could take away some of the legitimacy of the Persian Shia Islamic Republic and play more of an important regional role as Turkey does. And so
in other words, compete with Iran for influence rather than enhance it. To what extent do you think the people within Iran have been able to keep track of the full scope of events taking place in these countries? Is government control of the media sufficient enough that they might actually think that these are essentially movements in the mold of the Islamic Revolution of 1979, or think that this is an entirely anti-American sort of phenomenon? Is the government's stranglehold on information that strong?
There is definitely government censorship and lack of access to both lack of access to outside news and shutting down of reformist newspapers. But it's a similar situation as we can see even here in the U.S., where either side can still get the information that they want to back up their assumptions. And so there are people still within Iran who are staunch supporters of the Iranian regime. And so whatever Khamenei says, they're going to believe at face value. Then there's others who, especially after even, I would say, an increasing number of Iranians after the Ahmadinejad's 2009 election are skeptical of what the government says, and they're going to be seeking outside sources of news through satellite feeds and accessing outside news through filter breakers.
Right, which leads me to my next question. The Green Movement has planned a rally for the 25th of Bahman, the 14th of February, and some Iran watchers have speculated that the revolution in Tunisia and the recent ouster of Mubarak in Egypt will essentially serve as a huge shot in the arm for the Green Movement, and that we're going to see a massive turnout and concessions from the regime in Iran. Does your own analysis support this view?
I think that a lot of people will turn out on February 25th, and as you said, it kind of shows a resurgence of the Green Movement's more proactive tactics of bringing people out in the streets, which hadn't been the case since last year's after the Ashura demonstrations, where the regime really cracked down hard. And then the 22 of Bahman, or February 11th of 2010, was kind of the last time we saw a large Green Movement presence out.
So almost a year, really.
Almost a year. So I do think that there will be a lot of Green Movement protesters out in the streets. And the fact that they chose 25th of Bahman, which is 3 days after the Islamic Revolution's victory, it's not on the exact day. They're deciding to celebrate on a different day than the Islamic Revolution's victory, is a criticism in and of itself. However, I don't think that it's going to extract any concessions from the regime. There's probably going to be crackdowns if the demonstrations become large enough. I think with the Green Movement is what we're going to be experiencing with the Green Movement is more of a long-term underground civil rights movement that's going to be taking a decade or perhaps decades to come to fruition.
So no easy victories there. Now, in terms of this attempt by the Green Movement to resurrect the tradition of street protests, in 2009, 2010, there was a heavy kind of reliance on social media, just as we've seen in Egypt and Tunisia, Facebook, Twitter, mobile phone networks. And the Iranian regime quite heavily came down on these networks, shutting down the internet, shutting down mobile phone networks, blocking sites like Facebook. To what extent are those restrictions still in place, and to what extent is the Green Movement unable to mobilize because of these kind of measures?
There are efforts by the government to restrict access to websites like Facebook and to restrict access to Twitter. However, that's not the reason that people aren't out in the streets. The main reason that people aren't out in the streets is because of the major crackdowns that they experience and the government's willingness to do so. The Green Movement is still one step ahead of the game regarding filtering and things like that. The government does put forth a lot of effort to do so. However, it's very expensive. They don't want to completely shut off all of the internet because the regime itself also uses the internet for its own various purposes, and it doesn't want to completely isolate itself from the international community at this time. And so, again, I would say that the tools that enabled the Green Movement to really amass and coordinate in 2009 are still there. It's just the willingness to be able to, the willingness to come out in the face of possible repercussion or violence and persucution.
Well, that the violence that you speak of is in some ways a facet of the wider phenomenon of the militarization of the Iranian government that we've seen, especially since 2005 with the election of Ahmadinejad. Many commentators have said that this, wouldn't have been possible without the express support of the supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei. Now that there are real tensions between Ahmadinejad's camp on one hand and Khamenei's camp on the other, are we likely to see any slowdown in this process of militarization? And does that mean that Iran has a better shot at seeing domestic political reform and perhaps a less confrontationist foreign policy?
It's a good question. Currently, there is a pressure against Ahmadinejad's march towards military dictatorship, which I believe he is in favor of and his group is marching towards. Some analysts believe that it's inevitable that that's going to happen. I don't see that as the case currently. There are other conservative, especially conservative pragmatists like Speaker of the House Ali Larijani,
right,
his brother Sadegh Larijani, who is the head of the judiciary, who was appointed himself by the supreme leader as what seems to be a counterbalance against a rising Ahmadinejad. At the same time, as you mentioned, the president who was basically put in place by Khamenei as kind of his underling has gained his own power base and is becoming even more powerful. And so what we see now is a struggle between three different groups in addition to the Green Movement. So you have the Ahmadinejad camp, the pragmatic principalists, and then Khamenei himself, who is trying to balance both of these groups so they don't end up controlling him in the long run.